Thank you. Committee of the Whole is back in order. I know you're having something copied, but Senator Nicholas, you have your amendment. It's been circulated.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. As we can observe in the amendment that's been circulated, I'm putting exception language in the beginning to exclude Chapter 5A, G, and H, and that's the Office of the Governor, the Department of Administration, and the Department of Revenue and Taxation. These are the three entities, Mr. Chairman, that we have tagged the SAR collections to. And so if we further restrict the spending authorization to only be 25% of the appropriation, and if the appropriation is already only 25% funded by general fund money, then we'll be only giving them 1/4 of 1/4 to operate the first quarter of the fiscal year, and that's too restrictive. The intent of all of our work in this budget, Mr. Chairman, has not been to be obstinate. It's been to try and craft a policy environment that is aligned with the expectations of our people, but is also something that can continue to move this island forward. And so the intent of this amendment is to just ensure that the unintended consequence of not amending this would basically make the situation for the Office of the Governor, the Department of Administration, the Department of Revenue and Taxation overly encumbered if we do not exempt them from this particular section. So I humbly ask my colleagues to support this. I think that if we add this language in here, then everything becomes workable for all parties. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Nicholas. Just the formatting, it just needs to be Chapter 5, Section A, G, and H. But that's technical up here. They'll handle that. Any other senator wish to be heard on this section? No objection. Senator Uggan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know that there's an inclusion for the exception to include the Mayor's Council of Guam, but there's been a request from one of their primary representatives to exclude the Mayor's Council of Guam because they're not in an election mode, so their expenditure pattern will continue to be consistent. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move for, on line 19, the Roman numeral 8 be deleted.
Just so everybody understands, that's a chapter in the Mayor's Council, so.
Yes, thank you, thank you.
Is there any objection or anyone which wish to be heard on that amendment? Vice Speaker?
Can you just explain why they would need that, Mr. Speaker? Is it to purchase a large item or
no,
something?
it's just this restriction is a provision that we usually put in during transition periods.
Yes, but why would we allow any agency to spend more than 1/4 of the budget in the first quarter? For what purposes do they need it for? So we saw some examples of we're in contracts that are being paid early. We're in COLA that's being paid like lump sum early. But for the mayors, I'm curious what those are.
I'm not going to speak for the mayor. He spoke to them. He'll.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, one of the concerns was the mowing or the maintenance of the schoolyards was highlighted in terms of being able to meet those obligations and encumbering the necessary funds. Also, there are other programs that the mayors administer on an individual village basis that they're asking at least the flexibility. They understand the budgetary restriction and the allocation is just give them the opportunity as mayors of their respective jurisdictions to be able to manage their resources prudently. So that is the request.
Is that satisfactory, or do you wish it? Any other senator wish to be heard? Any senator wish to be heard? Any objection to the amendment striking Chapter 8? No. No objection? No, Chapter 8. Senator Torres, we're still bookmarking, but if Vice Speaker, are you ready with the travel one? Or you're not making? All right, Senator Torres, go ahead.
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment to page 131, line 16. And this would be to add a new subsection I to include travel to attend conferences and official meetings of national and regional organizations of which the entity is an official member. Mr. Chair, this doesn't give them carte blanche, but it does give certain agencies the discretion where they are official members that generally are required to attend, or it is in their best interest to attend national or regional organizations that they are official members. It gives them the latitude to attend if it is within their budgetary if budget permits. So this would, for example, allow a judge to attend a conference of chief justices, or the attorney general to attend an attorney general's conference, or those types of organizations of which they are official members. And oftentimes they reap certain benefits as a result of those organizations and the networking that they do. Benefits in terms of direct grants to their agencies.
On the amendment, Vice Senator Torres, Senator Estevez.
Mr. Chairman, just a question for OFB, or for you perhaps. The way, for the same reason, and the way deputy directors were removed from the budget when the numbers were appropriated and adopted, now with regards to additional travel, was based on the travel restrictions placed in the budget, were those line items and those travel removed from the budget? Is it budgeted for?
It was not placed in there. Remember, we built it from the bottom up, and we provided for warrant bodies certain contracts and no travel.
Thank you. Now, for the same reasons, I guess that was highlighted in Section 4, because this was not budgeted in the budget, and it would set the budget off balance. I'd have to object to the amendment unless we find additional appropriation.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator Nelson.
Mr. Speaker, I also would have to object to this amendment. I do support the previous speaker's comments, and as well, we fought very hard to keep judiciary untouched. We even included $500,000 for tax amnesty so that they can implement their electronic monitoring program. So if the money is that scarce and we're running very thin, I'd have to object.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard? Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess I would also object because I see the importance of these things, but we've pretty much cut out all travel. We've even cut out training. We've cut out kind of critical travel. We've cut out all travel for the governor and DOE to go talk to DOI and things like that. And so I just think we might need to come back and reassess this when the reality of it hits. But it looks to me, I guess, I don't know. I just think it's fair if we're going to cut all of those other kinds of travel, especially employee training and certification, possibly, you know, that we just have to hold the line. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And just to point out to the members, the exception A and B is one, federally funded is still there. Travel that's specifically required to administer and secure federal funding is also still allowed. Okay? The total savings in here was going to be about $450,000. Right? Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The one thing that jumps out at me of this amendment is I'm just concerned that if we are already an official member of a national or regional organization, we may have already paid some substantial dues to be a member of that organization. And if we already paid the dues, then not attending is almost, we basically paid for an opportunity that we're now going to be intentionally excluding ourselves from. So perhaps the amendment reads, travel to attend conferences and official meetings of national and regional organizations of which the entity is an official member. The other thing that jumps out at me is, if we paid for the membership and if we've been active in these national organizations, especially like, you know, the national, the State Governors Association, for example, or those kind of things, and then all of a sudden we stop showing up, it just may, that might actually have some of the wrong kind of connotations, especially if there's certain grants or considerations that are being factored. So does the language, I understand that we have language here authorizing for grants. Mr. Chairman, do we know if the participation in these national and regional organizations has that already been budgeted for? Is that included in the budgets of the agencies or entities?
No, we didn't provide for it.
Has it ever been a specific line item? Is it a specific line item that we struck out?
The amounts that were requested, we did not provide.
I see. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Torres.
I feel very strongly about pushing this issue, and I feel strongly from having had a position where I was in a leadership position with many government agencies and attended such things, and also being aware of many of the programs and funds that we've received in Guam that have enabled us to stand up, for example, many of our programs, including our rehabilitative court programs, a lot of programs with the Department of Education. Although it's not specifically to secure federal grants, they are grants associated with organizations and national organizations. And so I implore everybody to just, if you can think about it from my perspective, where a little investment sometimes in time and networking and being an active part of an organization where you can sell the cause and the need for assistance to Guam goes a long way. And I know for a fact that we've seen that kind of direct benefit from participation. Now, I know that we're looking at cost-cutting measures, but what I'm doing here is I'm allowing for travel of this nature to occur. Now, agencies can have that, they have that discretion to prioritize spending where they realize that they can afford to invest in these types of things. I'm not saying that I sanction everybody going to conferences, but we do know the direct benefit that Guam has seen as a result of that. Let's just look at our court system for an example. Many of the monies that they've gained as a result of them being a part of these conferences and selling Guam's case and getting the attention of participants in those conferences. It's a giant network, and the only way that you can ever afford to, the only way that you can avail of things is to be a player, and you can't be a player if you don't participate. And that's all I'm saying is if we just cut out the ability of our agencies to, in their professional discretion and fiscal discretion, decide when and where they need to participate so that they can gain advantage and benefits to Guam, I think we need to give them that latitude. they're not going to spend money where they can't, but let's at least give them the option where they're able to do that. Trust me, I've been in that situation, and I know that being a part of something and an organization and representing your island and your cause and making the cases is worth sometimes that little bit of sacrifice. But I'm coming from that point of view, and I just know that Guam has realized a lot from these types of national and regional organizations, and where we can realize benefit similar to what is anticipated in sub-item B, travel that is specifically required to administer or secure federal grants. Oftentimes these types of travels will result in that, although they may initially not be for that reason, but they do result in that through the networking and the advocating of Guam's cause. So please give it your consideration. It's not a fruitless idea to have this in as sub-item I. Thank you.
Thank you. There's been objections. All those in favor of the Torres Amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. Senator Seves, you have one on customs and quarantine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is to Section 1 on page 130. And what it does is it allows for Customs and Quarantine, gives CQA the authority to hire Customs 1 officer positions, and that exempts this type of recruitment from the hiring prohibition. Now, the justification again for this is Customs and Quarantine is special funded, and so I know there is movement again to increase their user fees, which is going to generate more revenue. And so this gives them the flexibility that once they do that, that they're able to start the hiring process to start filling the shortages necessary to maintain the borders and prevent the inflow of drugs into the community. And so I ask my colleagues to please support this amendment.
Any senator wish to be heard? Senator Uggan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I certainly support this amendment, recognizing that Customs and Quarantine at one time had a little over 200 uniformed personnel, and now they're slightly either closer to that number or just below that number. They had a significant number or significantly more uniformed personnel about 15 years ago, and they continue to tout that and claim that they need to move back to hiring additional customs officers, and at least this will give them the authorization for this upcoming fiscal year despite the financial challenges. And also, this is also in recognition, Mr. Speaker, of the tremendous importance that Customs and Quarantine Agency officers provide to this island community in terms of ensuring that they protect our borders from not only individuals who may come in here without authorization or legal authority, but also drug interdiction and several other aspects in terms of protecting our community. So I certainly support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Any other Senator Nelson?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support this amendment as well. We introduced a bill to allow Customs to hire more personnel, more officers to protect our borders. We've seen a lot of drugs hitting our streets, and there's no appropriate labs to build these drugs, such as crystal methamphetamine on islands. So all of the drugs that, as far as crystal methamphetamine and some of the other drugs that are affecting our community, really are being imported. And Customs and Quarantine do need an increase of personnel. They need the support to do their job, to protect our community. So I must definitely support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Any other Senator, Vice Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, could you please clarify which page this is supposed to go on?
It's going on page 130, on line 19, after bus driver positions and before Guam Election Commission.
There is a provision here for the Customs and Quarantine Agency, the entire agency.
No, the first part is the,
Or is this different than filling
the first part is
positions?
only to replace vacant positions as they become vacant. And so the second part is to
All
allow
right.
for.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, I support this amendment. I hope that this will result in increased border, protection from drugs, from invasive species. That's very much needed, and so I really hope that they use it very wisely. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. On this amendment, anybody else wish to be heard? Is there an objection? There being no objection, thank you, Senator Esteves. We're back to section 8 and 133. Suspension of renewal or extension of qualifying certificates. There's currently an executive order for a moratorium. This just statutorizes in the budget. Anyone? Any senator wish to, Vice Speaker, and then Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate this section that is going to suspend renewals or extensions of QC, and also it looks like ban any new QCs except with legislature approval. So if this is enforceable, then I'm very much behind it, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
We hope it is. Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Uggan, actually,
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Vice Speaker just alluded to something as to she hopes that this is enforceable. How would this work, Mr. Speaker, just so that I understand? It would read, any new first-time applications for qualifying certificates shall first be approved by Legislature in Guahan prior to the approval by Magalahin Guahan. Now, if I read that verbatim, it's very simple to understand, but wouldn't this branch, as a policy branch, now be venturing into approving individualized applications versus setting parameters and restrictions? So, like, for example, no new qualifying certificates shall be administered, period, would be a policy. Now, in this case, requiring that this branch first approve something that necessitates all the other documents that the Guam Economic Development Authority has to put together, compile, consider by their board, say, okay, they concur, it would now come to this legislative body and proceed to the executive branch. I'm just kind of leery about how that process will work rather than a policy.
it's not that novel. We do it with all the bonds.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, if you want to use that as an argument versus, or as a statement versus looking at individualized applications, the bonds, there are parameters.
There are
the bonds
fewer,
required because
there are fewer QCs than there are bonds, unfortunately.
Just to, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Just on that note, though, Mr. Chairman, isn't public indebtedness organic? Isn't that an organic stipulation? And that's why the approval of public indebtedness has the special involvement of a legislatura. This section, Mr. Chairman, does have merit, but I'm just concerned that that final sentence With the massive amount of compromise that has gone into this budget thus far, I'm afraid of any veto message that comes back saying we put something in here that may be inorganic, and then it locks the body up to be unable to support a veto override for fear of pushing through inorganic language. And this last sentence, I'm afraid may be close to the edge on that. Don't get me wrong, I'm definitely a fan of a legislatura having to approve qualifying certificates, but I'm just not sure if by first enumerating a process under law that creates a contractual basis for the administration or for a government corporation to be able to move forward with contracts to thereafter require those contracts to be approved by the legislature. And that's basically what the qualifying certificate is a contract between the QC recipient and the government of Guam that allows for the QC recipient to receive rebates of their taxes in return for meeting certain contractual stipulations. Now, you and I both know, Mr. Speaker, the QC program, there's just a lot of work that can be done over there. But I'm just concerned about putting a provision in this very compromise-laden budget that may cause it to get pushed back as being inorganic.
Is that going to be an amendment to strike?
At this time, yes, Mr. Chairman. Motion to strike that last sentence.
All right, Senator Nicholas has introduced an amendment to strike the last sentence in Section 8. Any senator wish to be heard on it? Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the comments of previous speaker. However, just in case this does get challenged, it would only be this one section. It would not affect the rest of the budget, I don't think. And I think it's worth a try, Mr. Speaker, that, I mean, we can't affect existing contracts, so we're going to have to live with those. But going forward, it's really a very good attempt by the legislature to control any issuance of new QCs in one fell swoop. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard on the St. Nicholas amendment to strike the last sentence? Senator Esteves.
You know, Mr. Chairman, I think under normal circumstances, I think it's well within the authority based on the law for GITA to handle it with approval by the governor. But considering the times that we're in and the financial realities of the government, I don't think it's, while I don't object to the amendment, I just want to state as a point of concern, I don't think it's a bad idea that with regards to qualifying certificates similar to bonds that, you know, to put it in the most plain language that we require a fiscal note. And so, you know, same way we would be going through with bills to see whether it's something that can even be funded or something that's affordable or fiscally responsible. I think it would be a benefit to have approval by the legislature, considering how contentious the qualifying certificate program has been recently. Although we have many notable successes. I just want to state that for the record as a point of concern, but no objection to the amendment.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard? The amendment on the floor is to strike the last sentence. There is currently no objection. Oh, wait, yeah, I'm sorry, the Vice Speaker is, there is an objection. All those in favor of?
Yeah, if I may close, Mr.
You
Chairman.
may close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to be very clear. I support absolutely the intent of this last sentence. I'll be more than willing to vote for it and stand behind it. However, I'm concerned that this may be a veto trigger point. And while I understand that it's worth the effort and worth the try, I'm concerned that we may not be able to get the 10 votes necessary to override a veto if in the governor's veto message he makes it plain that we have put an inorganic stipulation in there. That is my concern, Mr. Chairman. And I'm all for what this sentence represents. I think that it's something worth trying. I just don't think it's worth trying in this budget bill, given the highly sensitive nature of all of the provisions that we've been through and the challenges that we will have to overcome with the governor already not just telegraphing but plainly stating that he does intend to veto this bill. If he vetoes it and also says that it's because we put an inorganic provision in there, I don't think there are members of this body who would want to override a veto and knowingly pass something that's inorganic. I also don't know, Mr. Chairman, I suppose the severability clause at the end may provide some comfort. Perhaps we can cross that bridge when we get there on a veto override, if that's part of the basis for the veto, that we can just make the argument and that members here will accept that, oh no, it's severable, so it's okay. But that's just the reason why I proffer the amendment, Mr. Chairman. I'm trying to help us to get to a place where we're going to be able to muster the support necessary to move this very delicate budget bill forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. There's been an objection to the San Nicolas amendment to strike the last sentence. All those in favor of striking the last sentence, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. Anything else on 8? If not, Section 9, restriction on home use of Guam vehicles. Senator Uggan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe this particular provision is a carryover provision from this fiscal year's budget. And my question is because this is perhaps one of the larger numbers of complaints or concerns that have been raised and brought to the attention of my office about the abuse of government vehicles. Who would enforce this particular provision? Or how is it being enforced? Because unfortunately, I don't see that as a big component of having something in law, codified in law, and then not having the community or our government officials restricted from using these vehicles.
Unfortunately, we are only a legislature. We can only pass legislation. We cannot go out and start enforcing them.
I just hope, Mr. Speaker, like I said, it's really one of the more prevalent complaints that I've heard from our community, and it's certainly something that has to be fully enforced. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. On this amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Is there an objection? Senator Uggan, I understand you have another amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, after taking a look at Chapter 12 and also the title of that particular provision, I believe it's a lot more appropriate that this provision be incorporated into this chapter should it get the necessary votes. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move for the placement of the following amendment. It would read Section 10, I believe, Mr. Speaker.
Correct.
Restriction for executive security, notwithstanding any other provision of law, rule, or regulation beginning October 1st, 2018, no government funds to include but not be limited to the general fund or special funds shall be expended for the purposes of funding executive security for Imagalain Guahan or Isigundo na Magalain Guahan. I know that, Mr. Speaker, one of our colleagues has a proposed amendment that she would like to add to this provision. Mr. Speaker, it somewhat concerns me that we not only have the allowances for executive security, but we see executive security absorbing almost equivalent amount of overtime expenses to the rest of the police force. And the rest of the police force, Mr. Speaker, are these men and women in uniform are protecting the entire island community, inclusive of our visitors who come to Guam. And the primary purpose behind this is to allow for all those who are assigned to executive security to be reassigned to the departments, the Guam Police Department, so that they can actually provide public safety services for the entire island community. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask for the consideration of our colleagues. We're looking at ways in which we can better use our people resources in the government, and I believe that this is one way where we can better apply our uniformed law enforcement personnel, especially the Guam Police Department personnel, to provide public safety services to our entire island community and not necessarily to two individuals. And this, Mr. Speaker, should not preclude emergency situations or situations in which there are threats. So I acknowledge that, and I believe that, like I mentioned a little earlier, one of our colleagues would may want to proffer an amendment to this. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
On the second amendment, Senator Ada, then any other senator after Senator Ada?
Mr. Chairman, just a point of order. I believe the amendment should be section 20, correct?
No,
Or section
he's going to
21?
put it on this page, on page 134, and make it a section 10. He has it,
Okay, because it says
yeah,
140. All right.
it's wrong.
Mr. Chairman, does this restriction include executive security for the spouses? Or if it's only going to England?
Mr. Speaker, I mean, if the good senator would like to amend it, then certainly, but the intent is if the Magalahi Guahan and the Segundo Magalahi are not eligible to have executive security, then certainly it doesn't extend to the others unless there is a threat.
There,
Just a point of,
I think maybe I'm going to have to get a point of, if you would yield, Senator. I'm not sure if you intended to have this a restriction in the travel or completely wipe out executive security.
It's to reassign the Guam police officers who are presently providing executive security to the community.
Okay, so it is clear. It's to disband executive security, have them all return to the different divisions within Guam Police Department, out in the community, in the precincts. Senator Nelson.
thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a point of inquiry. What is the cost of the executive security?
See, it's really difficult to try to figure that out because you have their basic pay, then you have all of the overtime. Some of them were getting $10,000 in 2 weeks. And when I asked the question about whether or not it was travel or completely, their request for travel was $80,000 just by itself, which we did not provide for. That didn't include their per diem and their, no, that's just their travel cost. Yes. That was just travel. For the executive security, they've now stuck it under the commander as opposed to it used to be under the chief. And so now it's hard to follow, trace how much is being spent.
But wouldn't they be able to detail these officers anyway?
The question was, wouldn't they be able to be detailed anyway? That would be a command decision, wouldn't it? I would think.
But they'd still have the authority to detail them,
Based
no?
on my read on the amendment, Mr. Chairman, even if they were detailed, this language would restrict that because it says no government funds for the purposes of funding executive security. So if you're detailed, you're still expending government funds as a detail, and that would be an uncertifiable expense, because the law, if we pass this language, would say no funds can be expended for that purpose. So a detail would not be possible.
Point of inquiry, Mr. Speaker, but wouldn't they still be able to detail under something other than calling it executive security? Like we have a special assistant to, but you're getting paid as a director, but you're a special assistant? So it, okay.
Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that last comment because it does seem to me that, you know, we want the chief of police to have the authority to detail wherever. For example, if I'm under threat, I hope he's going to, you know, keep an eye on whether I'm going to be, you know, killed or something. I mean, seriously, these threats do occur. And so I was going to make an exception or an amendment to make an exception for unless an emergency is declared by executive order. And I think we've seen this in the history with the governors, that they do get threats sometimes, and I want the police not, I'm hoping they understand we're not restricting them from doing what they need to do to make everybody on Guam safe, especially our governors and lieutenant governors. We just don't want personnel assigned there excessively, you know, accumulating excessive overtime, and it's unfortunate that over the years they haven't adjusted their policy to just avoid the overtime, and so it continues to be a big issue. So I know this is an attempt to cut these what look like excessive expenditures. We can't control what the courts do, but I also hope that the courts will examine, you know, how they use marshals and for security, pretty much. And courts, you know, when they're doing criminal cases, I think they are at greater risk. That's the theory, and so I appreciate that risk that they are under. And but I do think that, you know, we could also that they would be, I'm just hoping that they would also be conscious if we're going to restrict the governors, that, you know, everyone on Guam has to do their part to just be as practical as possible, to, you know, to really determine whether there is an emergency, whether there is a threat that is active. And so my amendment, Mr. Speaker, would just to add the words at the end that say, unless an emergency is declared by executive order.
To the Elgin amendment, the Vice Speaker has proffered an amendment except when there's an executive order. Pardon?
What's the proper wording, Mr. Chair?
Go ahead.
Unless an emergency is declared by executive order.
Senator Torres.
Mr. Chairman, we were talking about the security of our chief executive of our island with very broad powers and responsibilities, and the least that we can afford our executive is security. So I object to the amendment, the amended amendment, the amendment to the amendment, and the amendment in general, let's not get into a pattern where we're legislating against an individual or a circumstance. I think that overall we have to look at the broad picture, and our chief executive deserves security. Now, if we can be a little more prudent with how we expend monies, and we can be a little more responsible about overtime occurrences, those are policy calls that we can demand. But I think fundamentally our executive deserves security. And I also speak from a personal perspective, where I know firsthand what it is to be a family member of a chief executive. And however you feel about them, they are entitled to executive security. So I oppose this amendment and the amendment to the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard on the Uggan amendment?
Just a point of order. I think we're on the amendment to the amendment right now.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yes. On the Terlahi amendment. Senator Espadon and Uggan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I understand the reasoning for trying to qualify when executive security can be provided. However, sometimes if there is a threat, a known threat, that may be found out by the Department of Public Safety or the Guam Police Department, the move is to go and immediately protect the governor, whether or not there is an emergency that is declared by executive order. And so I don't think, you know, as well-meaning as this amendment to the amendment is, I believe it's impractical. If there is an emergency and the governor needs to be protected, there is no time to wait until he signs an executive order. He needs to be protected. So I object to the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you. Senator Estevez?
Just a
Oh,
question.
I'm sorry.
Just a point of inquiry, Mr. Chairman. Isn't there, did we pass, trying to think back, was there a statutory change in terms of the execution or implementation or start date of an executive order?
Yes.
Okay. And so, you know, with that in mind, while I understand the intent of the amendment, I think considering that there's a delay and with the potential of an emergency situation, I don't think an executive order is a prudent way to determine or allow the flexibility of the agency to make the determination to provide that security as needed on an emergency basis. So unfortunately, I have to object to the amendment.
Okay. Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Uggan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Mr.
Perhaps
Speaker,
the,
I would like to withdraw my amendment, if I
okay.
may. Yes.
All right. The
okay.
amendment's been withdrawn. We are now just on the Uggan amendment. Now, does anybody want to be heard on the Uggan amendment? Senator Espaldon.
Thank you. I understand the concern of expending funds and the use of personnel or the overuse of personnel. You know, sometimes we see the governor. However, that being said, I think it's the call of the of the chief executive. In other words, even without this provision, if the new governor or lieutenant governor who comes in say, we don't need all this personnel around us, all I need is one guy, then that in itself will constitute the savings. So it really is the judgment of the chief executive of how much security he should need or if he needs any at all. I remember at one time when I ran for lieutenant governor, there were all kinds of people saying, I want to be on your security team. And I said, you know, I don't intend to, if I do get in, I don't intend to have anybody. I'm going to still drive my pickup by myself. And I'm, you know, I don't need anybody sitting at my wife's shop. And I think that's a judgment call by whoever is in that position to really not allow any executive security for the governor or the lieutenant governor may not be the most prudent thing. And also, in that same vein, just the way this is worded, and it may be subject to amendment, right? Executive security, right now we're only talking about, at least the proffer of this amendment was really talking about the use of GPD personnel. But if we eliminate the need for GPD personnel to be the executive security, does that mean, and I think that issue is broached also by a colleague of ours, does that mean that he can't hire any security whatsoever? And I don't think that's prudent either. I mean, if we eliminate it, or if we qualify it to say that, you know, for the purposes of funding executive security provided by GPD personnel, then that's a whole different issue. But that's not what this says. It says executive security, and that's a very broad term, which eliminates any security for the governor or lieutenant governor. So unless there's an amendment, I can't support this amendment right now. Thank you.
Senator Estevez?
Mr. Chairman, based on the discussion, I think the retiring speaker makes some valid points that really have me considering this amendment moving forward and my support for it. But I'd like to ask the mover of the amendment if he'd be amenable to allow for executive security to be acquisitioned as determined by the chief executive, but costs associated would have to come out of the budget allotted or appropriated to their office and their operations as an operational expense of the governor and lieutenant governor, as opposed to an operational expense on the department, on the Guam Police Department. Would that be, would there be some flexibility on that? And then second point, Mr. Chairman, I apologize, is that in reading this section, I think this section can stand alone, notwithstanding any other provision, rule, law, or regulation, beginning October 1st, 2018, unless the subsequent budget, fiscal year budget next year, would have this or remove this or fund this. I believe this provision alone as a rider to the budget would stand, could stand alone, and I'd just like clarification on that. So it's not only that we're banning it for the fiscal year or for this particular government. I think as a policy decision with this amendment, it's looking like we're just saying there will be no executive security ever for any governor, regardless of the situation and regardless of how it's funded. And I don't know if we could necessarily make that determination with regards to the intent of future governors and the intent of future legislatures.
Senator Agan? Did you wish to have a comment, Senator Snockstein, first, before we go back to Senator Agan?
Mr. Speaker, in comment to his amendment? Yes.
Please.
No, Mr. Speaker, I can understand the author of the amendment, but being a former police officer, if we try to apply this to the governor, we're not applying this to the courts. We're not doing this across the board. I don't support this amendment. Number one, I don't think it's wise to allow our governor or lieutenant governor to go out there without being secured, regardless where they're at. And I just don't understand. If whoever's governor, and if you don't want the security, return the police officers back to the police department. That's your option. And that should be left at that. It shouldn't be, we're not going to protect our governor. We're not going to protect our lieutenant governor. I think this is kind of, being a former police officer, I think it's not reasonable or sensible to even see. Thank you.
Any other senator who wish to be heard? Senator Lee.
Mr. Desmasi, Mr. Chair, I also have some concerns with this amendment. I remember, I think it was last budget cycle, we were going through the costs for executive security, in particular executive security overtime, and we were comparing that number to the overtime for the entire Hagåtña precinct. And the Hagåtña precinct overtime was dwarfed by executive security overtime. I was amazed to see that number. And so I proffered an amendment, which I believe passed in that bill. I'm not sure if the final bill actually passed, but to allow for the cost for executive security overtime to be paid by the governor's office. And that's something that I think is reasonable. And that is something that I think we should consider here, that perhaps we should not allow for overtime, but allow for just for funding executive security for imagalahin guahan or isagundo na magalahin guahan from the governor's office. And I'm not sure if the previous speaker had made that amendment as an official amendment, but I would like to, if not. So it would be notwithstanding any other provision of law, beginning October 1st, the funding of executive security for imagalahin guahan or segundo na magalahin guahan shall be funded through the office of imagalahin guahan. So we're not restricting all government funds, but we're restricting it to the governor's budget. And maybe legal can help us clean it up.
Let's take a short recess. Committee of the Whole is back in order. Senator Lee, is your...
Sidus Maasi, Mr. Speaker. Yes, the amendment to the amendment now would read, restriction for executive security, notwithstanding any other provision of law, rule, or regulation beginning October 1st, 2018, executive security for Imagalahin Guahan or Isagundu na Magalahin Guahan shall only be funded with appropriations in Chapter 5, Section 1A, and that's through the governor's office. And so essentially what this would I really appreciate all the discussion by my colleagues and the proffer of this initial amendment, but this gives the governor, the lieutenant governor, the authority to make that call. And with kind of their limited resources in their budget, hopefully they will be forced to be frugal, and they will be forced to really think twice about expending this money because it's coming out of their pockets essentially, but it still allows them for that protection, and it still allows them to have opportunity for threat assessment and to just feel safe in our community. So I thank my colleagues in advance for their support.
On the Lee amendment, Senator Uggan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask thank the good senator for proposing an amendment in this case, because the reality is you could literally release anywhere from $700,000 plus to about $1 million of costs that otherwise can be utilized by the Guam Police Department specifically to either recruit additional uniformed police officers or to sustain the existing workforce that they presently have. So I think that that was definitely part of the consideration in terms of making sure that the resources that are allocated directly to the Guam Police Department stays with the Guam Police Department, with all due respect to the Commander-in-Chief or the Governor as well as the Lieutenant Governor.
Okay. On the Lee amendment, any senator wish to be heard? On the Lee amendment, Senator Espaldon? Is there an objection to the Lee amendment? There is an objection to the Lee amendment. This wasn't circulated? No, not there. Yes, there was. There was an objection. There is an objection. All those in favor of the Lee amendment, please indicate by raising their hand. No. Motion fails.
How many were in the hall, Mr. Speaker? And how many affirmative?
7.
7 affirmative votes, and there are 2 of our colleagues that are missing.
The legal has said that for the overall passage of the bill, yes, we will use the decision of the Supreme Court, but for amendments...
So even the decision of the Supreme Court as it applies to amendments is not...
legal has told us we could use it differently. It's
okay. Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the amendment, which would be back to the original, because the Lee amendment failed. All those in favor of the Uggan amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. I think that closes 12. Pardon? Chapter 13. Part 2, authorization for matching requirements for federal grants and aid. Section 2, carryover of local and federal matching program funds for grants. Section 3, Government of Guam Retirement Fund rate of contribution to 26.56 this year. Section 4, Autonomous Agency Revenues and Expenditure Reports to Imagalahin Guahan and Ilasaturan Guahan. Facilities Insurance Requirements, Section 5. Reporting requirement for nonprofit organizations. Fund reversions, Section 7. $137. Section 8, Transfer Authority, Magalahi, 15%.
Mr. Speaker, what's the approximate amount of the total executive branch budget? Because I know there are some exclusions.
15% of what number? $621. One second, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Total general fund that can be eligible is about 250, but it's 15% of that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
It's of the 600 or 700 that we're appropriating, only 250 million are actually eligible because we've excluded DOE, UOG, and GCC. Those aren't within the. So he has 15% of 250 million.
Point of inquiry, Mr. Speaker, did we allow 15% on the FY18 budget? I think do we usually fluctuate it?
Though we've been criticized, yes, it's been this 15% for over 10 years. The Democratic legislature has given the Republican governor 15%.
Mr. Speaker, would it be possible to, is there a rhyme or reason that we can't put it down to 10% considering the state
if you're willing to make that motion, I'm just saying.
Would it be possible for him still to manage?
Yes, if you wish to make the amendment to 5%, there's no pride of authorship in the 15. Senator Nelson?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just like to amend it to read up to 10%.
All right. The Nelson amendment is to make the transfer authority 10%. Who wishes to? Senator Agan?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On that amendment, I know, Mr. Speaker, that you've always, or either yourself or the clerk's office, every time there's a transfer in funds by the chief executive, that we are given notification. So I really, in the last year, have not seen too much transaction. So whether 10% or 15%, because 15% of 250,000 is approximately $37.5 million versus 10% of 250,000 is $25 million. So, it's still a lot of flexibility in terms of being able to manage the resources of this government, especially with a supposedly tight budget. So I'm somewhat indifferent with the proposed amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Estevez?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to have to object to the amendment. I think because of all the cuts, we're going to have to allow maximum flexibility to manage the cash. I think we're aware of the ebbs and flows. And so the inability to manage cash, depending on those peaks and valleys, is going to have significant repercussions in terms of being able to pay out accounts payable, whether it's paychecks or anything like that for Government of Guam employees. I think the responsibility of cash management belongs to the executive branch, and I think as long as we take out the individual agencies, education, the legislature, and other elected positions that operate in large part independently, I think we need to give now the flexibility to the chief executive to be able to manage everything else. It's going to be difficult enough as it is with such a hefty payroll, but decreasing the ability to move money around is just going to exacerbate that. I apologize, but I have to object to this amendment.
Thank you very much, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard on this motion? Any other senator? All right, you may close. Okay, call the question. There's been an objection. All those in favor of the Nelson amendment, please indicate by raising their hand. Motion fails. Section 9, email address of GovGuam funds. Section 9, please. Section 10, uniform allowance.
Just a point of inquiry, Mr. Speaker. This Section 10 uniform allowances, does that apply to law enforcement agencies? What is the, who authorizes the uniform allowance?
We're allowing for it here.
For everyone or just law enforcement agencies?
Wherever there is a need for, there is a
Uniform?
requirement for uniform.
To include reservist officers of the police force. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Anyone else? Any objection? Oh, I'm sorry.
Just wanted, so are you saying that you authorized uniform allowances in operations, or in what category? I mean,
It would be in their supplies, and so this is how, as much as we are allowing them to spend. I know I've received complaints in the past that the uniforms are actually more than the $150, and but right now this is as much as we're allowing for right now. I mean, I'm sorry, shall not be less than $150. So, whatever they're willing to give, and they may not have enough money to do that. So, okay. GovGuam staffing pattern. These are reporting requirements. Funding source. Our
Mr. Speaker, I just want to put it on the record and get your concurrence that this is a departure from last budget, where there was a specific section that authorized the use of all special funds for almost any purpose. And so this is going back and restricting all these special funds can be used as they come in, as the revenue comes in, but only for the purposes authorized by statute for those funds. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this section.
Section 13, appropriation allocation report. Yes, Senator Adams.
Can we just go back to section 12? Now, where would Chamorro Land Trust, which generates its own funds, would they not be included in this? Because right now, for example, for their operations funds that comes in, that revenue source is from rents and whatnot, but it has to be appropriated, and then the survey and infrastructure fund, same thing.
I've been advised that that's actually in statute already.
Like for the Chamorro Land Trust? But we have to come in and appropriate it. Okay.
Section 13, appropriation allocation report. Section 14, GovGuam Health Insurance Program reporting. It's requiring them to submit their reports. Section 15, appropriation reserve report. Section 16, quarterly reports of the medical referral office. The medical referral report, that's been in statute. Unfortunately, we haven't been receiving it. There was only one report. I think that the clerk provided me with a report from April, which was the only one this year, and there hadn't been one for like 2 years.
Mr. Speaker, are they, the medical referral office, is this contracted out or,
Correct.
and are we funding this?
Yes.
What is the cost?
We defunded it, but it's being funded out of the governor's office. They're able to fund it out of the governor's office if they decide that they want to.
I'm just wondering what the cost was because when we tried to get a hold of them earlier in the term, we weren't able to really get a hold of them.
Okay, hold on a second. I think I can pull up the report that.
Also because, Mr. Speaker, there have been a lot of concerns with some of the patients that are looking for assistance to the medical referral office. So I'm just wondering, is that because it's a lack of funding, or is it because?
We did get a report dated April 30th, 2018 from the governor's office, the number of patients and accompanying, and they even broke down the cost per patient. But that was the last report.
Okay. But can you, is there a number figure for the contract itself? The amount of money that they contracted, what is the cost of the contract? And who is it contracted to? Do we know those things? I've never been in a public hearing with them present, so perhaps I might have missed it.
I don't want to misspeak, so I can provide that to you. I'll send this document out.
I'm just a little concerned, Mr. Speaker, if they appropriate the contract does not meet the services of the people that are seeking its assistance.
According to the report from April, they are still providing services and actually breaking down how much it's cost per patient. It's in your WhatsApp box right now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But that is inclusive of the contract itself, correct?
That's
or do
the
they
problem that I have is.
Do they pay for the contract services and then they pay on top of that for the per patient? Is it? I'm just.
When I had the clerk's office do a search for anything from the medical referral office, there was no files in the 31st, 2nd, and 34th Guam Legislature. They did find a referral, the report for the second quarter, the April one that I just sent to you.
So this is the
first... we have no idea what the total amount is. We've only have one report on file.
This is the first time we received a report in.
According to the clerk's office, I will send that to you also.
4 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. Seven, quarterly reports, medical referral office. Seventeen, audited financial statements, supplementary information. Senator Lee.
Thank
On
you, Mr.
reporting for
Speaker.
travel.
Yes, just returning to the amendment that I attempted to proffer earlier, reporting requirements for travel. So this would just add onto the end of this section. This shall apply to all government entities and shall include the traveler, the source of funds, the purpose of the travel, and the cost of the travel. And I know this is with the understanding that travel has already been significantly restricted, but we just want to make sure that we have as much information on any travel that's being done as possible. Thank you.
On the Lee amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Any objection to the Lee amendment? Section 19, Guam Police Department and Department of Corrections, overtime reporting requirements. Vice Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, if it might be beg your indulgence to just, on section 16, when you said we haven't funded it, but it may be continued to be paid out of the governor's office, yet they haven't submitted any of the required reports in the past year, do you recommend we do more, perhaps, to restrict any use of funds for this in fiscal year 2019 without, you know, I want to say without further legislative approval, or at the very minimum until they submit their reports? You're not able to tell us, I'm thinking, if without the reports, how many patients are being served?
The only report that I have is from April, and in all your senadots, it's in there.
All right.
And the clerk provided me a report of what she was able to find. That's only for the second quarter of 18.
All right.
And the clerk went and searched their files and submitted a complete report of all the reports that have been received by the medical referral office. And the report that I got back from the clerk's office was that for about 3 legislatures, we were getting nothing. And then we got this one in April. I'm not sure what happened.
All right.
Not the oversight chair for...
Do you remember in that report how many patients were being served?
Yes, it's in...
Oh, okay, we'll check it out. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
It's in everybody's senadots rather than printing it out. Makes it easier
I
for
beg
me.
your indulgence, Mr. Speaker.
Okay.
So because we have not received anything in the 31st, 32nd, and 33rd legislature, does that mean that the Guam Medical Referral Office was not operating during those years? For 6 years, they were not operating?
No, they've been operating, and at the time, the last I heard was that the person that had the contract was a legal firm.
Who's the legal, Mr. Speaker, who is the legal firm?
As I understand it, the contract was Tom Fisher's for a while.
Even during those years where we haven't received any records?
Ever since the beginning of this administration, that he's had the contract.
But were they not supposed to submit reports in the 30th?
I've just been advised that the reporting requirement, we put in the last budget. It wasn't there prior, and that's why we're having it in now
So in the
to require.
31st and 32nd, it was not required? this
Correct.
reporting?
And
All right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
there was being, if you look at it, it was being provided before, and then it all of a sudden stopped. And so we put the reporting requirement back in again. Okay. Have we done with the medical referral office? We were on 19 for the reporting requirements for GPD and DOC overtime. It's just a reporting requirement. Then the last section is the severability.
Mr. Speaker, remember when DOA was here and we learned about the special funds that had been transferred out of, I'd like to put language in here. Did you come to a conclusion on that as to, I mean, they said they were able to do it with the authorization, for example, of the director with oversight of the fund. And that seemed like all they needed to do that. And I could never find in law how they were authorized to do that. Were you? Because I would just like, otherwise we can put in general language unless there's a specific gap in our law that's allowing them to do that. Are you aware of a specific gap?
I apologize. I did not follow up on that to try to figure out if there was a specific. But if you want to prepare an amendment, we would. You may introduce it. We're just now coming to the close of the chapter, and I'm going to go back to the official bookmarks that are on record. Okay, on the bookmarks that I have an amendment by Senator Ada for a bookmark on page 89 with the Chamorro Land Trust Survey and Infrastructure Fund. Senator Ada, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On line 16, page 89,
Yes.
I would like to, so the amendment's been passed out, and it reads to add a new subsection 2 to section 1CC, chapter 5, to read appropriation of Chamorro Land Trust Survey and Infrastructure Fund balance. The sum of $34,725 is hereby appropriated from the unappropriated fund balance of the Chamorro Land Trust Survey Fund to the CLTC to be expended pursuant to and as it's provided by law.
On the Ada amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Any senator wish to be heard? Any objection? That is the only bookmark that I have an amendment on. I know that you had bookmarks that I don't have the amendment here. What? On page 55?
Yeah, I had, Mr. Speaker, I just had a note that there was a bookmark for OFB to come back on page 55.
Oh, it was the amount for streetlights, and and I think the question was how much we collected. We collected 4.2. And the spending was 5. The difference was funded by highway funds. All right. I have no other bookmarks. I take that to mean that, oh, Senator Estevez.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I guess for formalities, I'd like to ask my colleagues if they'd reconsider opening Chapter 2 for the purpose of me proposing an amendment to adjust the cap for iLearn Academy Charter School from 500 to 620. But I believe the motion would first need to be to allow that to be reopened, and I ask my colleagues for their indulgence.
There's a motion for reconsideration. Any objection?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've passed out an amendment to my colleagues, and based on discussions with the charter school, the amendment is to increase the number from 500 to 620, consistent with the current approval by the council. It has been brought to my attention that 500, in conjunction with the reduction, would put them in a very difficult position, and there might be consideration, if not because of the deficit that they would be contracting, might be the consideration of closing. I just want to highlight that 620 is still below what they should be. Based on their charter, they should really be a lot closer to 900 this year in their operation. So I'd humbly ask my colleagues to consider the number at 620 to continue the success of iLearn Academy Charter School.
On the Estevez amendment? Senator Torres.
Just a question to the author of this amendment. Does this figure 620 represent the actual enrollment, and so it's necessary to increase it? Because I thought they were at 5, but is it truly 600 enrollment this year?
So they're limited in how much they can officially enroll, and that's based on the cap and approval from the charter school, primarily the cap. So they are enrolled at 500, but they have a significant wait list, and as I understand, still have parents calling daily to see if there are any openings to fill those spots, and they can't give them any answer until there's an up in the cap. But I did let them know that even if the cap was raised, it would still be contingent on the budget being passed and signed into law.
Okay. Senator Torres, you have any further questions? Any comments on the amendment?
Okay, so I guess what I'm trying to get at is, are there children who are not enrolled that are dependent on this number being increased? I imagine if they're not enrolled here, they're enrolled in another DOE school.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's the cost aspect that's just concerning me. So this 120 will basically be another 120 students that we're going to have to pay for to the iLearn Academy Charter School. And if it was a clean lateral movement of DOE students into iLearn, then we can say that it's just cost centers shifting. But this might actually include private school students going from private school to iLearn. Is that, do we have a breakdown of how many of this 120 is, or are we limited? Perhaps we should just limit it to to Department of Education lateral transfers, or because, Mr. Chairman, if we increase it from 500 to 620, and it's not all DOE students, then that money is going to be shorted from DOE to make up for the difference. And this is already a tight budget. We're basically saying that we're going to open the door to cut DOE further for the money to go to iLearn charter school in order for them to cover the cost of private school students transferring into there?
As I do understand, they are still trying to work on the numbers, not iLearn specifically, but Department of Education. That's been a contentious issue in terms of tracking the number of transfers from the private school to iLearn or any of the charter schools, which are public schools. But I think it's important to highlight that regardless of whether the child is in public school or private school, there's a responsibility. And so I think it's a fluid transfer. So if any student from private school decides to go to not even just a charter school, but just a regular public school, that's going to have an effect on funding towards public education. But again, that responsibility, regardless of whether this year they're going to private school or this year they're going to public school, I think still falls on the government. Now, I do understand that Department of Education is working to rework the formula to figure out what the cost per student is. I don't know when that process is going to happen. I just know that in us reducing the number, the continuous number of 500, which they've been continuously capped at, has put them in a situation that they might not be able to maintain operations under the charter.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard?
Just some follow-up statements, Mr. Chairman, if I may. I still have the floor.
Yes.
The $6,088 per enrollee to the charter schools, is that based on dividing the number of appropriations by the number of students in the Department of Education? Is that a clean per pupil cost?
The per pupil cost was set 3 years ago at a public hearing with the Department of Education when the CFO proudly boasted that they were educating 31,000 students at $6,500 per student. At the time, we were only providing the charter schools $5,500. So I said, if you're going to gloat and say you're doing it at $6,500, then these are students whose parents pay taxes. Whether they go to private school or public school, their parents pay taxes. So I don't usually defend it. I mean, I was not in favor of the charter schools in the beginning, and I'm not really that crazy about them. But these are our children that we have to educate, and I don't see the distinction between private school kids and public school kids as it relates to the movement, because when there are changes in family situations, a loss of a job, no longer able to afford to pay for the tuition to private school, kids move to the public school.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for informing me of that. I'm actually very much aware of that. My concern, Mr. Chairman, has nothing to do with public or private. It has everything to do with these allotments, and that's why I'm asking the question. The $6,088 per pupil cost is inclusive of the unfunded liability that we're paying in the Department of Education. These charter schools are not incurring that unfunded liability cost. And so if we want to talk about parity on a taxpayer basis per pupil, the public school kid in DOE is not getting the same kind of per dollar support as the charter school kid, because the charter school is not making a contribution to the unfunded liability from its budget. So if we want to talk about parity on a taxpayer basis, Mr. Chairman, that's my point. If we're going to be increasing this to 120, that money that we're taking from DOE at $6,088 per child is $1,800 more per child than what we spend on the students in the public school, because that $1,800 goes to fund the unfunded liability of the retirement fund. 30%, let's make it 25%, $1,500. And so on a per pupil basis, we're actually overpaying on the charter school by $1,500. I'm the guy that will always talk about parity, Mr. Chairman, on a taxpayer basis per pupil. These charter schools are not providing, are receiving an additional level of support than what we're giving to our regular, I don't know how you can make a distinction between them, but from our regular high schools, our regular public schools. And so for us to already be giving a $6,088 per enrollee is already an elevated per pupil payment. To elevate the number of pupils, I mean, of course, these charter schools are going to be able to be a lot more attractive than our standard public schools because they don't have an unfunded liability cost. So I understand that Eiler wants to increase its enrollment, and I'm happy that they're doing well, but why are we funding these charter schools at a higher level than our standard public schools? And we're going to continue to see this attrition and these numbers, these requests for these numbers to keep getting bumped up. And all it's going to do is it's going to continue to starve the Department of Education schools, the $1,500 per pupil. I mean, let's just do the math, 120 times 1,500.
When you do the math, you also shouldn't take just the 220 million that's going to DOE, include the $10 million for Teton, include every single lend-lease that is going to be for all the schools that have been built, because the charter schools are having to pay rent, save for Guam Academy, which for some reason is still at Teton. And that's where the parity is off again, because GAX was getting free rent where iLearn was not. And so it really is difficult to determine what that 6,500 is, because do you include that in there, those lend-lease agreements and the Teton lease, and up it to 300 and divided by the 31,000. And so I'm just saying, DOE was the one that gave us the number 6,500. They were the ones that said it, all right? I did calculations, and it's different, and I'm not going to say what I thought the calculations ought to be, but they said 6,500. When we reduce DOE from the 230 that it was getting down, that percentage difference, we also, the 7% that we, 6.35% that we deducted from the DOE appropriation for this year, we took a 6.3 cut on the 6,500 per student. That's how the 6,088 came up. Okay?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for bringing that up. I was actually going to highlight that we have to consider what we pay out of the general fund. That's not part of the overall appropriation to Department of Education. So you did mention the Teton lease, but also considering the debt service that we pay on the new high schools or the new schools that were built, I think inclusive, which take both from the general fund and the territorial education fund. I don't know what the exact calculation is, and I think Department of Education is still trying to figure that out. And I would be comfortable, I think, with a good formula moving into the future to ascertain that. But even if we were to look at a number, even say lower at 5,500, as was initially provided to the charter schools, I think the fact of the matter is there's a tracking based on their charter, and they are significantly below what that number should be on where they are at. And so if you take the funding amount and draw the parallel and compare that to how many enrollments they have, that's going to be the determining factor, because if we're going to drop the number, I think we need to allow a little bit of an increase to the number they're really supposed to be at in terms of their enrollment and their charter that was approved. So while I understand the objections, you know, I I just always want to cautious us of the theme that somehow these public school students and the charter schools are somehow taking things away from Department of Education. They are all public school children, and we have a responsibility to all of them. And so I think the success of the charter schools really lies with us in what we allow them the authority to do based on the charter that was presented that would ensure their success. So I ask my colleagues to support the measure.
Any other senator wish to be heard? The Vice Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, is the council allowed to continue to increase these caps on pursuant to the charters?
Unfortunately, your Attorney General has said that they are. In the original 323, I did not include Guam Academy because at the time I thought that they had not complied with the statute and so therefore could not or should not have received a extended charter. The council met, they extended the charter, not even probationary, they gave a full 5-year extension. And so we wrote to the Attorney General and asked, is the council allowed to do that? I have to live with what this current Attorney General has opined, and she has opined that the council was within its authority to grant that. I may differ, in fact I do, but I have to live with the opinion that's been given to me by the person that's in charge.
And for example, this shift from up to the new number for this one school, are we able to plan that for the next 5 years, or is that going to continuously be changing every year? They're going to continue to increase enrollment, and there's no cap, or is there a cap?
No, there is a cap, and each one of the charters has a provision and has been stated by the mover of the amendment. The charters that were originally approved had escalating numbers going up. GACS is supposed to be up way over 1,000 at this point. iLearn is supposed to be at 900 this year, according to the charter. But I've told them, that may be your charter, but the appropriation can only afford this much. And so that's why, though GACS had 900 students last year, it only received funding for 740 and had to suffer and eat the difference.
All right, I appreciate that explanation, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to weigh in on that parity discussion in that, yes, DOE is spending a lot of money, but even within the schools of DOE, for example, the high schools, it's not an equal amount that's being spent on pupils in GW as is being spent on pupils at TZN or different schools. And so there's a lot of disparity. And I just wanted to remind, I remember that being the discussion when when the legislature was trying to figure out what's the amount going to be for charter schools in the very, very beginning. And that's the unfortunate part of it, is that there are going to be schools in the public school system that students are receiving much less than these amounts that are stated here, Mr. Speaker.
And it's true, and I believe at the time when Speaker Wampat was here and she was doing a study, there were a couple of elementary schools that, because of their small number and the number of teachers that they had, and especially senior teachers, theirs was at 15,000 per student. And so I only used the number that their CFO used, and then I reduced it in the same percentage that I reduced the overall GDOE budget. That's the best that I could do, because I can't get anybody to agree what the real cost ought to be. Any other senator wish to be heard on the Esteves amendment? Is there an objection to the Esteves amendment? Is there an objection to the Esteves amendment? Thank you. Did you have an amendment left?
I did have one, Mr. Speaker. This is Village Streets.
Was this bookmarked, or you're going
Yes.
to have to reconsider?
I thought so. Yes. Page 59. I wasn't sure whether it was going to go there, but we talked about it, and so we talked. I would.
Okay, then you're going to have to do as Senator Esteves did and just ask for reconsideration to reopen that section. That chapter 5.
All right, Mr. Speaker. Then I will ask for.
There's a motion to reconsider to open chapter 5 to allow for the amendment on the Village Street resurfacing. Is there any objection to the motion to reconsider to open that section?
It's on page 60.
60.
59. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is pretty much, I'm trying to close a loop that I think exists in that the liquid fuels tax were increased during 2018, yet according to Public Works and DOA, they have not used that increase. So this is to take what they estimated it to be and use it for additional village streets and roads resurfacing and repairs during 2019, Mr. Speaker.
Where did you find that there was a fund balance? Because we don't show a fund balance.
This is, well, this is from what they told me at the public hearings. I don't have any documents.
Okay, it's just that we have no record of a fund balance, so this appropriation from a fund balance that doesn't exist. Or there's not this amount that's in any fund balance that we have. Okay?
So what does that mean, Mr. Speaker, that they spent it someplace else? Because
or they
DPW
never,
definitely did not get it, and it's supposed to be.
It may not have been received or raised.
No, DOA confirmed in writing that it was received. Not the amount, but they said, yes, they are receiving the increase in the liquid fuels tax. And it is being deposited into the Guam Highway Fund.
And the amount that they received.
I just don't, they've
yeah,
never confirmed it.
I'm not sure what the projections were and whether or not it was or was not, did live up to the projection. That's the difference. You may continue with your...
It should be on your desk. Well, I would like to pass this, Mr. Speaker, subject to confirmation of an amount with DOA, if that's who would have it, right? DOA? And really, it's supposed to be the increase in the liquid fuels tax because that was when it was not appropriated.
We're trying to close this budget tonight and leaving it open right now. There is an amount already for village resurfacing, and I think it's sufficient to start.
Yes, that's the amount that's expected to come in during 2019.
Correct.
And I just think it's a waste for this money if it's there, like they say, to be sitting around and that they're not able to do what it was intended to do, fix the roads, fix more roads.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have the amendment in front of me, but is there actual dollar amount to the amendment? 3.5.
If you want, and you deleted the 3.5 million and just said for a mini fund balance, that would we could go with that now. and just have it read the fund balance in the Guam Highway Fund for 2018 as of September 30th. Without an amount. I'm just...
Point of inquiry, Mr. Speaker, if, since the liquid fuel tax increase, DOA did say that they are receiving money for that. Now, I'm just wondering, are we not tracking this funding source? Are we not tracking it? Is it getting thrown into the general fund and losing its color?
It is being received. The amount, I have no idea how much has been received. Unless, Sandragan, if you can lend us some.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, based on the information that was provided under the CRER, dated as of June 30th, the tracking for the Guam, this is under the Guam Highway Fund, correct? Okay, under the Guam Highway Fund, the overage, anticipated overage by the end of the fiscal year is $791,048. But, Mr. Speaker, the projected numbers of July, August, and September does not reflect the increases between January through June of approximately $400,000 to $500,000 a month. So I just wanted to share that with you. But right now, based on their CRER report as of June 30th, there's $791,000.
Senator Nelson.
So that means that he said $400,000 a month from January to...
And so it's being used somewhere, I have no idea. But the balance is only 791 right now.
So it would roughly be about 3.5 million if they didn't use it someplace else.
It would actually be closer to 5 million but
so they should have, since they haven't implemented it, then that money should be there. No?
They've been also doing some resurfacing. I think you've been around
Yes.
Island.
But not in the tune of $5 million, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
So I talked to the Director of Administration, and he's saying the balance right now is 2.5 million. But I am willing to say from the balance without putting an amount. Does that work for you and OFB for purposes of the budget balancing? I think it shouldn't matter. It's a 2018 amount. So he said there will be a balance at the end that's not been appropriated.
That's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I only questioned that $2.5 million figure by the DOA director when, in fact, the CRER is signed off by himself, inclusive of BBMR and Revenue Tax. Thank you.
I only take the... So if we can just do it, that from the fund balance that it'd be all used for. Can I have legal write that up then? And that would be, does everybody understand that? There's no specific amount. It's not 791. It's not 2.5. It's not my math of 4 times 12 being almost 5 million. But
no objection.
We'll just have it, the fund balance. The fund balance of the Guam Highway Fund as of September 30th, 2018 shall be authorized to be expended for the purpose of funding additional village streets and roads resurfacing and repairs. The DPW shall submit a monthly status report as to all village street repairs undertaken in FY19.
Except that you said authorized to be expended as opposed to appropriated. They keep saying they're not going to spend it without an appropriation. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to say appropriated.
All right, fine.
Thank you.
Okay? Is everybody clear on the amendment? The fund balance of the Guam Highway Fund as of September 30th, 2018 shall be appropriated for the purpose of funding additional village streets and roads, resurfacing and repairs. The DPW shall submit a monthly status report as to all village streets repairs undertaken in FY19. Okay? Anybody object to that amendment? No objection. Thank you. Senator, did you have?
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I think this is an appropriate time to raise this information. I guess earlier information was received regarding the amnesty tax amounts. And I know that earlier this evening we've been appropriating it left and right. And it appears that as of at least information that was issued tonight by the chairperson of tax, that the balance as of August 6th was only $9.4 million. And which then, you know, brings a lot more relevance now to the question that was also asked earlier about prioritizing these appropriations. So I'm just concerned that, you know, we've done all these appropriations. I think if I recall, it was over $9.4 million.
Very definitely. A couple of things. One, the amnesty will extend until September the 5th, so there could be more money. The other thing that we also all have to understand is, though we may have wanted to appropriate, depending on when this thing is signed, he could pay all the tax refunds before then and undermine all of the appropriations that we've gotten. I would hope everybody understood that. He has spent the first 16, and so just understand that, okay?
How much in tax amnesty did we appropriate so far?
16.1. Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If we can just reference the documentation that was provided to us from the Department of Revenue and Taxation, I don't think the extension of their amnesty period is to increase the amount under the taxes due column. I think it's just to extend the time to be able to collect what is the taxes due, because the taxes due was on an initial window. You had to come in and file within so many days, and then that window closed, and then they gave you so many days to pay. I think what they're extending is the number of days to pay. They're not extending the window to file, so I don't think we're going to be getting anything more than this 34 million. Based on this spreadsheet they provided, they've already expended 25 million of the 34. And so there's actually only 9 million left. If we have 6 million in appropriations of amnesty money, and there really is only, as of today, as of August 6th, only 9 million, we are already over appropriated on the amnesty balance. And so I appreciate Senator Ada bringing this matter up at this juncture, because we need to go back, and we need to not only readdress the figures, but we should priority order the appropriations if we want to specifically fund certain things before others. As an example, Mr. Chairman, we've taken a $4 million Medicaid matching fund balance and just put that out there to be used for amnesty money. Now, don't get me wrong, as with other things that I'm hoping nobody got me wrong about tonight, I'm not against funding Medicaid. However, that appropriation in the course of our proceedings here was more so to utilize what was assumed to be the full amount, and not necessarily to make that be as much of a priority as meeting CMS costs or as much of a priority as meeting any of the other items. And so not only should we reconsider the figures that have been appropriated thus far, but we also need to reconsider the order of priority. Because at the end of the day, if we do pass this budget and it is signed within 10 working days, and at the end of all of that, there's only $5 million left in the amnesty balance, we want to at least make sure that the 5 million top priorities that we talked about here tonight are the ones that are going to get funded and not the 5 million that are going to get pulled out of a hat or be decided by the administration that might not necessarily reflect what our $5 million priorities are here. So that's, I know it's late. I know we want to conclude this evening, but that's the realities that we have on the ground right now. A $16 million amnesty appropriation on what is right now a $9 million balance. I mean, if the whole intent is balancing the budget, we already know that's not there on the amnesty side.
Yes. And I think the only thing that the administration hinted to us in the beginning that they were going to be covering was the 1.5 for GDOE and the 5 million for the hospital. So all the other ones that we appropriated, I'm sure he'll just line item them and, item veto them, or just not fund them. That just isn't, and with all the problem that we have with having too many appropriations is that unfortunately you leave it to the administration to make the decision. And if there's more than one, there is no such thing as priority.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And that's one of the reasons why, I initially had suggested that those two particular provisions be extracted and that we deal with them on an individual basis, because just looking at the balances, the two previous speakers certainly highlighted that there's approximately $9.4 million that is still collectible based on the 30-day extension. And really, this is a question, and we had them before us because of session. I guess the chairman of Rev and Tax had to postpone or reschedule his hearing. But we do have a draft that says, or information that says that as a result of the tax amnesty program, which would have collected, is anticipated to collect $34.4 million, $25 million has been collected to date. Now, the question that I have, again, Mr. Speaker, is if the $25 million has gone out to tax refund, that's an existing obligation. The government has to pay it as soon as possible so that, in fact, it doesn't have to pay unnecessary interest, but most importantly, to get the tax refunds out to our people. But we don't know if, in fact, the entire $25 million has been allocated and spent on tax refunds. So that's still another question that's lingering in terms of how these proceeds, above and beyond the initial projection, based on discussions and the passage of 34-87, how these funds are being expended. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Anything else? And I want to apologize. I have to make one correction. My office did receive on the 31st of July a second report from the Guam Medical Referral Office, and I have sent it out to all of you just now. Okay? So I stand corrected. They've been 2 reports. Thank you. Is there anything else? Otherwise, I think a motion to rise would be in order at this point. Okay. Hold on a second. Why don't we do this? I'd like to be able to vote this weekend. Okay, because, so how about if we send out to everyone the bill tomorrow afternoon and we schedule a vote on Saturday afternoon? That'll give you all the time to read. Pardon? If I can get the bill out to you tomorrow afternoon, you read all the, yeah, they're trying. And so we'll get the bill out to all of you tomorrow afternoon. And what time on Saturday can we vote? 1 o'clock?
Can we make it at 11, Mr. Speaker?
Okay, hold on. Saturday at 10? But they said, what's your candidate thing at 11? Right, it's Saturday, but 10 o'clock. Please, everybody. 10 o'clock. All right. They say they can be ready by 12. How about we all meet at 1? As soon as they finish, we'll shoot it out to all of you. You look at it, and we can then, with the committee rise from the committee and vote even tomorrow afternoon. All right? 1. We stand in recess until 1 tomorrow afternoon.